Greetings, students. I hope you're all well, you're all safe, and you're all weathering this strange period that we're going through. This week I'm going to distract you with what I hope you've all had some experience with, not just James, which are the Arthurian legends, which have bled quite successfully into pop culture, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So this first video, I'm going to give you a bit of a background, and then on the second video we'll talk about the two texts that you were to read for this week. King Arthur is a well-known figure, and we consider him to be pseudo-historical. In other words, we think he's a figure of history, but we can't quite place him. The most confident placement that we have is that he was a 5th century king that led the Britons, which were the ancient people of Britain, against the Saxons, which were the first group of invaders in the Middle Ages. But there are many rival claims to his personhood. His story begins, the first accounts begin with him being a Romano-Briton, a Briton living in the period after the Romans left the island, but still had a presence, and he was a remnant of what was left behind. And if you've seen the film with Clive Owen, King Arthur, that it centers kind of in that period, on that story. But he's also claimed by the Welsh, and there's a lot of early myths about his Welsh background. The Scottish have myths on him as well, particularly on Merlin for Scotland. Southern England developed a strong claim as place names like Glastonbury and Tintagel became connected to him. And of course northern France in Breton or Brittany was probably the largest rival claim to the English claim. He's known as Arthur or Arturus, or Arturius would be his Roman name. Artgur would be his Welsh name, or Arcturus, which is a constellation in the Ursa Minor. So he's definitely linked in a mystical sense as well. The Welsh/Breton works before the 12th century. He's clearly a warrior figure, not a king, more of a tribal warrior, a Romano-British tribal leader or warrior. The Welsh connected him to the world of fairy, and I don't mean F-A-R-I-R-Y, I mean F-A-E-R-I-E, which is the Welsh otherworld of Annwn, spelled A-N-N-W-N, sort of like the Irish myths. There's this other world that you can cross over into, which is a world of magic and mystique. And he's celebrated in the great bardic works of Taliesin and Aneurin. And he even appears in the Mabingonian, which is the Welsh prose work of the early medieval period. Now, I wish we had time to go into that, but sadly we don't. Then he sort of borrowed in various Latin sources. The Lives of Gildas in the 6th century connects him with real battles, and sort of is the first work to make him a king or a leader. So he fights in the Battle of Camlan or Medraut. And then the Duke of Malmesbury wrote a book about English kings in the 7th century, and this is where he's included as one of the early kings of England, and the first reference to sort of a Christ-like return. Arthur disappears off the scene, and then there's the promise that he will return. This is where we first see it, and of course that becomes very popularized. The problem with Arthur is he's not consistently reported on. For instance, probably the most serious historical annal of the period was written by Bede, and he doesn't appear in that. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't have any information on Arthur, so that's a difficulty. In the 12th century, we have a second great annal or historical work, History of the Kings of Britain, written by Geoffrey of Monmouth. And here's where we get all our popular names. We get Uther Pendragon, his father, Arthur, Merlin, Guinevere, the great sword Excalibur, the magical sword, Mordred, his rival, and the place names, Tintagel and Avalon and Glastonbury in southern England, Camlan in Wales, are connected to his story. Then we have the great French romances that come in that sort of relegate Arthur to almost a do-nothing king, sort of a sideline king. And that's where the stories start focusing on all the knights that he has around him. The first of which is the Lays by Marie de France, where he is mentioned, and some of the stories are cobbled for that work, which was very popular around Europe. Then our first reading for day, Chrétien de Troyes. He popularizes Lancelot, who doesn't appear in the early stories. So Lancelot becomes a main figure. The idea of the quest of the Holy Grail gets introduced, the Round Table. There are 5 romances between 1170 and 1190 which popularize Lancelot, and the idea that Lancelot and the Queen Guinevere, have an affair, an extramarital affair, begins to become a main story. And of course, Percival, who we read about in our first section today, grabs a main role for himself in this particular period. This is followed by other romances. The second reading today is by Robert de Boron, who also sort of developed Lancelot's role and really Christianizes the story. Remember, this starts out in the pagan British period and is interweaved with all kinds of Welsh Celtic magic, and slowly becomes Christianized over the course of history. And Robert de Boron really advances this, introducing Christian elements, connecting the Grail to the sacred cup of Jesus at the Last Supper. Then there's a new succession of Welsh romances that borrow from these French sources, changing Yvain to Owain, Peredur to Percival. So they sort of adopt the French names. There's a Vulgate cycle in the 13th century, mostly Latin. Further reduces the story of Arthur, expands Merlin. They seem to be obsessed with the character of Merlin, a great wizard, often portrayed in moral terms. He's either a good guy or a bad guy, depending on which version of the story you're reading. Galahad and Mordred become developed in the stories, as you can see in our second reading today. And the incestual relationship of Lancelot and Guinevere starts to become problematic. It's seen in the early stories as a figure of courtly love. Having a woman devotion was popular in this period, having a lady that you serve. But the sexual element of the liaison becomes problematic. So Lancelot becomes demoted as a character, and Percival and Galahad and some of the other knights even sort of become the top knight in his stead. And of course, Mordred and Morgause also have an incestual relationship. So these things are developed in this period. And of course, the whole post-Vulgate cycles downplay Lancelot's lust. They sort of get away from that problem and focus on the Grail search, which centers on other knights, as we shall see in the story. Then we have the Great Collator, the one that brings all the elements together in a massive work, the one that most films and books, modern books, adhere to the most, and that's Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory, an English writer, a late medieval cycle that attempts to fuse elements of the whole work and influences everything that comes after it, introduces some new elements himself, like the character of Gareth, develops Gawain, so sort of balloons out the stories of the knights. Then comes the Renaissance, and Arthur sort of disappears, wanes. There's a loss of interest in him completely, except for a couple of exceptions. Dryden's Mask, set to the music of Purcell in the 17th century. There's a couple of plays by Blackmore where he appears, but largely Arthur's forgotten and becomes sort of a medieval relic to be discarded until this, and let me read this to you. For many a petty king ere Arthur came ruled in this isle and ever waging war. Each upon each other wasted all the land, and still from time to time the heathen lost, swarmed over seas and harried what was left, and so there grew great tracts of wilderness, wherein the beast was ever more and more, but man less and less, till Arthur came. For first Aurelius lived and fought and died, and after him King Uther fought and died, but either failed to make the kingdom one, and after these King Arthur for a space, and through the puissance of his round table, drew all the petty princedoms under him, their king and head, and made a realm and reigned. And of course this is the great Sir Alfred Tennyson of the Victorian, late Romantic Victorian period, who writes Idylls of the King, and all of a sudden Arthur blows up again. He becomes massively popular. Wagner takes Percival and changes him into Parzival and builds these elaborate 5-hour operas around that character, and that becomes a big part of German law. And of course it then spills into contemporary accounts. Zimmer Bradley's Mists of Avalon was a huge book in the 60s and 70s, which basically borrows from Mallory's account. Borman's Excalibur was a film about the sword. Disney's Sword in the Stone, which you may have seen as a kid, borrows largely from the Mallory accounts as well. And of course, my favorite, Monty Python's Holy Grail, which is a spoof. But the thing about the Pythons is, as silly as they were all history and literature geeks. They were academics. So there's a lot of actual source material in the jokes for Holy Grail. If you haven't seen it, you must. It's on Netflix, I think, and you've got nothing to do. So watch it. It's a classic. And of course, the whole Arthurian legends influences things after that. We have the Templar and Hospitaller Knights, which become a holy order. Knights of the Holy Garter, popularized by Edward I. The Teutonic Knights, which became the SS in Hitler and Goering's time. Camelot, which became a symbol for the Kennedys and their group. And then this idea of the returning Arthur, the great king who's going to come back when his country needs him, was something that Winston Churchill alluded to during the Second World War, when it looked like Britain was lost to the Nazis. So Arthur continues to have lots of influence. You may have seen the recent Arthur movie with Jude Law, which is terrible, by the way, awful movie, or the one with Clive Owen that centers on the Roman period. So it's bled into our consciousness of the pop consciousness of this era, and you probably have some working knowledge of the stories. What I would like you to do today, that's basically my little history completed. What I'd like you to do today is sign in to this video, but perhaps put a little paragraph instead of just signing your name, and just tell me what your background is on these stories. Where have you heard of Arthur and Lancelot and the Round Table, and where did it appear in your childhood or in your upbringing? Or have you read or watched films about this mythology or system of mythologies? It'd be interesting to see what our influences are in the comments of this video. So I will be posting a video next that is to do with the two texts that we read for today. So please do so if you haven't, and then watch the second video. There will be a little in-class task for you to do. So be sure to watch that one, and I'll see you then.